today. My name is Mina Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and the Director of our Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency at Hofstra. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here today for our most timely panel on political communication and rhetoric in the 2020 presidential race. I would say that one day after New Hampshire and 1 week after Iowa, the results are in, we have much to discuss. I'm going to turn the floor over to my distinguished colleague, Professor Phil Dalton, in a moment. I just wanted to give a great thanks to everyone who has helped to put this event together. Our Hofstra Cultural Center, Athleen Collins, Carol Mallison, Suzanne Theory, our Office of University Relations, our Kalikow School and the Dean Ben Rifkin of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, our program in rhetoric and public advocacy. I see Professor Trasiati there. Several of my colleagues in political science, Professors Burnett and Himmelfarb, who've joined us. And then most importantly, Professor Phil Dalton in the Department of Rhetoric and Public Advocacy, who is a member of our Kalikow Center Faculty Advisory Council. Phil developed this idea really 1 year ago. We started talking about what's going to happen after Iowa and New Hampshire, and how do we evaluate the results. And he has invited two most distinguished speakers. One of them was here a year ago, and we're delighted to bring him back. The other one, I think, is visiting us for the first time. And I will turn the floor over to Phil to make the formal introductions. Please join me in welcoming him, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Mina. To my left is Dr. David Birdsell, the Dean of the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College of the City University of New York. A widely published scholar, his academic work centers on public communication, the intersections of communication and information technology, and the role of urban universities in the cities they serve. His scholarly work is focused on the nexus of communication, politics, and technology. He's one of the nation's leading experts on political debates. He comments regularly on politics and policy for print and electronic media, and his latest projects involve the erosion of trust in public institutions. And to my right is Dr. Basil Smikle, who is a political and policy consultant who holds a PhD in politics and education from Columbia University. As a thought leader and political strategist, he's a familiar face on MSNBC, CNN, and other media outlets where frequent appearances highlight his insights on electoral politics and public policy. Dr. Smikle is the former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party and was most recently the distinguished lecturer of politics and public policy at the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies, and he lectures at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs and Teachers College. My name is Philip Dalton. I'm a professor here of rhetoric and public advocacy, and I also help in that program to direct our political communication concentration. Okay, well, I'll set some of this stage with a few comments before I hand it over to Dr. Smikle and then to Dr. Birdsall. But we have some interesting outcomes out of last night's race. We have Sanders walking away with a win, 25.9% of the vote. He walks away with 9 delegates. Buttigieg walks away with 9 delegates. Klobuchar comes in third with 19, almost 20% of the vote, with 6 delegates. Warren notably comes in fourth, walks away with no delegates. And Vice President Biden comes in fifth. And you had to scroll past that on NBC this morning to the results to find out who the others were and where they stood. But Biden walks away with no delegates. I note 5 notable outcomes from this. First, Sanders won, so that puts him in the lead, I guess, in the narratives in the coming contests. But 2, Sanders underperformed compared to his New Hampshire performance in 2016, where he took 60% of the vote against Hillary Clinton. Third, Buttigieg took second, showing popularity following Iowa's strong showing. Fourth, Klobuchar took a strong third, suggesting voters are now coalescing around her as candidates drop out and as voters abandon other candidates. And fifth, Vice President Biden, who didn't compete much there, came in fifth and earned no delegates, which is noteworthy as a vice president. So one question came to mind as I looked at this, and that starts with, though he won, why might Sanders have done so poorly compared to 2016, from 60% to 25%? And I argue that Democrats are now talking about Sanders' issues. So he has shifted the debate considerably over 4 years. We're now talking about, and we have other candidates talking about considering and proposing ideas related to Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, free college, loan forgiveness, and taxing the wealthy is actually on the agendas of the candidates. It's something talked about with some regularity. So we see the debate has shifted. I'd argue that, too, that Bernie no longer presents a clear contrast to an establishment candidate who was Hillary Clinton in 2016. And though there may be some preferred or established candidates in this race, there's so many of them, perhaps, that it's difficult to draw clear distinctions between Bernie and some of the others. For many, the election is one of picking where on the political spectrum they sit. And this is encouraged by the number of candidates who were in the race, which topped out at 29 people in the Democratic race. Today we're down to 8, but we're still talking in terms of a spectrum of left to right within the Democratic Party. And the spectrum framework dominates a lot of public talk about the election and influences thinking and reasoning about it. We're influenced in our reasoning by the rhetorical frameworks imposed on the election, and that's done both by the candidates' talk and by the media narratives and language imposed on the race. And I look at 5 elements of this. I look first at talk about electability. Once out of power, the out party simply wants to win, and often voters can put differences to the side in the interest of winning an election. And we see this with a Biden ad that wraps up with "elect the candidate Trump fears most," or with a Buttigieg ad that says, "this is no time to risk." There's a lot built into that language. It's pregnant, so to speak. This is what I would consider an electability commonplace in the debate. It suggests some are electable while some are not, or not worth the risk. And to employ the language is to advance various assumptions that are baked into that rhetorical framework. If I'm electable and my opponent is not, what makes them different from me? Well, if they're further to the left, it implies it is their politics, their left politics, their liberalism perhaps. As a centrist Democrat, this allows me to recast my centrism, my willingness to compromise, which could be a liability in this particular race with an activated left wing, as an asset. I can win, they can't. Who are those people who can't? I guess Bernie supporters. Another element is talk of polarity. So I see this in particular with Mayor Pete's talk. He casts the election in the framework, a discussion of polarity, which functions, I argue, as a proxy for language of extremes. Now, right now, nobody, or I don't know, at one point ever, anyone wanted to be cast as an extremist. But it's a strange moment where nobody wants to be cast as a moderate. And so that language, being called a moderate or claiming the mantle of a moderate, isn't very popular. Not being polarized, on the other hand, is another way to recast a moderate centrist as positive or palatable, which is, I argue, the reason why Buttigieg uses the language. He is more of a centrist, and so you don't want to seem like you're moderating principles that people are talking more often about. You're just less polar than they are. A next theme that is emerging is one of unity, and we saw a lot of this with Elizabeth Warren's speech last night. She spoke last night about unity, a message warning against the party beating itself up on the way to the general election. And this is a criticism of people, for instance, perhaps Bernie brothers, who are claimed to have booed Klobuchar. I don't know who booed Klobuchar in the debate, but somebody booed Klobuchar in the debate, and she took note of that, and she assigned that to Bernie brothers. Bernie Bros. And we also have a Biden PAC, the Unite the Country PAC. So we see unity and the concern about it, which has kind of baked into it concern about the division that could be caused by those who pull us too far to one direction. I would argue that's to the left. Another theme we see in the election so far is one of diversity. It's an identity, a very important matter in this race, as it is with any race, but it seems to be a central matter. Who embodies the party is rhetorical. So whereas the diversity of the candidates may not on its face seem like a rhetorical matter, the embodiment of the party is, I would argue. And it has a great deal of rhetorical power to it. So now, following New Hampshire, 2 very white states have started our nominating season. And not in the process, not necessarily because of the outcomes of Iowa or New Hampshire, Deval Patrick, Andrew Yang, Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Kamala Harris, and Wayne Messam have dropped out of the race. That's not to say that we don't have a diverse set of candidates remaining. We have 2 female candidates in the race, we have 2 Jewish candidates in the race, and a member of the LGBT community. What I argue I see as absent in the talk in this race is plays on prejudice, explicit or even implicit yet. I don't see signs of people running against ethnicity or gender bias within the Democratic Party. And often you see claims or actual observations of dog whistle kinds of messages that are meant to tease or excite antipathies towards groups, and we're not seeing that within the Democratic candidates. Another thing we see in the race is talk of revolution. And Bernie is still talking about the election as a revolution, as a radical shift of the Democratic Party, arguably back to its ostensible principles. And while this has shifted the party's discussion and agenda, what we're seeing recently is Pete Buttigieg, I think notably, inserting language about deficit concerns into his talk, which I think it functions as a sign around which people who are interested in centrist politics can read into that as an attempt to be more palatable to a political middle. Meanwhile, other candidates will draw a contrast by advocating for issues that are like expansions of social programs. So I don't want to dominate the time, so I'll just give a quick overview, and that's that voters are clearly anxious, at least Democratic voters are clearly anxious about losing. And this probably shows in polls and focus groups. And the language we see the candidates using about this anxiety is being chosen and used to exploit it. And people with, I would argue, large quantities of money are backing moderate candidates and competing to mute or squelch the increasingly popular messages of Sanders and Warren and others that lean further to the left. And it shows in the growth of support for democratic socialism that we see in polls in the United States. So if I were to cast this, what we're seeing so far in this election, it is a struggle between those who have money that manifests in terms of, interest that and power that manifests in terms of money, and those who are advocating for the expansion of social programs. And we're seeing that struggle play out in these last 2 contests. Anyway, I will stop and invite Dr. Smikle to speak.
Thank you very much. While we're loading that, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
And we'll do that one more time. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Awesome. First, thank you, Phil, for inviting me. And I was here about a year ago, and I want to thank Will Davis and the Good Brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, my fraternity, for that invitation and for being here this morning. And I also want to thank the best teacher I ever had. My mom is here in the back. She's a little mad at me because I didn't tell her I was going to be here, and she's not. She says she doesn't live too far away. I thought she probably lived a little too far away, but clearly nothing's too far for your mom to come see you. Her colleagues from PS 107 and the former principal, Brother Frey, how you doing, sir? Good to see you. Thank you all for coming this morning. So there we go. That's perfect. Just make sure. There we go. So one of the things that I wanted to do, and we have about 10 or 15 minutes each to talk about this particular election cycle. One of the things that I want to do, since I'm here to talk about messaging and branding in this cycle, is talk through just a little bit at first how I view messaging and branding and narrative. We talk a lot about name ID, and that's really important. People's affiliation with a particular name, with a particular candidate, how much loyalty is built into that name, into that relationship, and enthusiasm. Are voters enthused about their particular candidate? Enthusiasm, I would say, even more than electability, is a very important sort of benchmark for me and for a lot of the people that I work with, in part because enthusiasm is contagious, right? So I have a colleague who works in Iowa and worked in the Iowa caucuses, and she related stories of how in one particular room when they're caucusing, people are in a room like this and they're sort of standing in each corner affiliated with their candidate, and there was a Biden corner and people were not particularly happy in the Biden corner, but in the Bernie corner and the Warren corner, everyone was yelling and chanting and there were signs, and you had a lot of Biden folks looking at that and saying, well, hey, why am I not over there? That means something. Enthusiasm is very, very important, and we talk a lot about that and think a lot about that when we instruct candidates or advise candidates about creating messages and narratives. What's going to excite? What's going to create enthusiasm? Messaging and narrative is also about conveying information. What you know about a particular candidate, what they choose to tell you about themselves within a specific kind of frame. Those messages are in many ways meant to convey sentiment, they're meant to convey emotion and activity. One of the things that's very important for us in politics is to try to get you from intent to behavior. I like this candidate, I want to support this candidate. Okay, now we have to move you from intention to behavior. How do we actually get you out to go and vote or canvass, volunteer in some way, even donate money? In many ways, message and narrative is a psychological construct. It's building a brand. If you see this phone and it's got a big apple on it, what do you think about when you see the Apple logo? How does that make you feel? You may say innovative, but also really expensive. If you see a BMW versus a Chrysler, do you have a different feeling about a foreign car versus an American car? So on and so forth. Those brands are very important, and candidates have brands as well. If you think about Mike Bloomberg, which I'll talk about in a little while, he's the businessman turned mayor. I'm going to run the city like I ran my business, so to speak, right? That's branding. But there's a psychological component to that becomes very, very important because, and this is something that I think in some of the research on political psychology brings to light. Voters don't often vote for what they think is the greater good. They often vote for what makes them feel good. And so we try to build that into some of the messaging and narrative of the candidates that we advise. And of course, you must be consistent and repetitive. Consistency and repetition is incredibly important in any brand, right? We want to make sure that you remember what we have to say, so we say it frequently. I would argue that Bernie Sanders is probably the most consistent candidate you've ever met. Like him or not, he's been saying the same thing for the last 30 years, 40 years, right? The same exact thing. I think, not John Oliver, Noah. Trevor Noah, on his show, unearthed Bernie Sanders' public access video from 30 years ago. He looks exactly the same, but he's saying the exact same things. That consistency and repetition, like it or not, is extraordinarily important for what we do. And mind you, you're not the only one doing this. You're doing it in the context of a particular campaign, and I'll get to that in a second. When we deal with messaging, it's not just about what you say about yourself, but what you want others to say about you. What's the takeaway? You may hear that term a lot. We use that term a lot. What's the takeaway? We're very intentional. What do we want you to think about us, and what do you take away from the statements that we make? Very important to this process is emotion. If we can convey emotion, that means we can convey sustainability. I would also say that one of my political mentors growing up, used to tell me that people vote for one of two reasons, pride or anger. I would also add to that fear is an extraordinarily powerful motivator in elections. Fear is a very important trigger. And when I talk about moving from intent to behavior, fear does that more so than most other things that we could ever convey. So when you hear candidates saying, well, he's just stoking fear or she's just stoking fear, that's done for a reason because it's extraordinarily powerful. And you know, one of the things about conveying emotion and conveying sustainability is conveying this concept of social sharing, a socially shared language. Bernie does that, I think, extraordinarily well, as do other candidates, and I'll get to that in a second. Another thing that we do when I talk to my students, and we do this with candidates, is this wonderful message box. It looks very simple, but it's an extraordinarily important concept in creating a message and a brand and a narrative. We want to know, how do we think about ourselves, us on us? How do they think about themselves? Your opponent, that's another candidate. You can do this in the public sector and private sector as well. You know, if you're Coke running against Pepsi, right? You're doing that exercise. How do they think about themselves? How do we talk about them? And how are they going to talk about us? Right? So as we start to fill in those boxes, we actually start to develop a finely honed, finely tuned message that we start to present to the general public. And you can't do it in a vacuum. There's our opponent. If you're a Democrat, there's our opponent, right? So all of the messages that the candidates are preparing for themselves before they get into this race and as they go through the race, narrowing it down and sort of fine-tuning it, is done with everybody mindful of the fact that Donald Trump, President Trump, is our ultimate opponent. So candidates present themselves as alternatives, not just to President Trump, but in the context of the primary, to other Democratic candidates. So when we had 21 or whatever it was, a small school bus full of candidates that we had at the beginning of the cycle, how difficult was it for one to sort of categorize themselves and create a lane for themselves that was separate and apart from someone else? You may not see those real divisions until now, or perhaps even a little further down the road as the field winnows that down a little bit. But presenting alternatives to one another and to our ultimate opponent is very important. The fact that we had a lot of candidates at the beginning presented a kind of cognitive dissonance. Too many candidates, too much information, too many decisions for me to make, to choose between them or among them. So it's good that we're at this place now where we've seen a lot of them, to some extent, we've seen a lot of them sort of come off the trail. And the ultimate winner here, we need to get to that person quickly because if we're going to create enthusiasm, if we are going to really buy into that candidate's message, we need to pay attention to it much more closely. Hard to do that when there are 5, 6, 7 other people running. And another sort of political rule of thumb that I have is that anger only gets you to 49%. You actually need to embrace your candidate to get to the 51%. So anger against Trump, which is what you do hear a lot, and granted I'm on TV a lot, and I know that my colleagues speak anger about Donald Trump all the time. But if we as a sort of collectively don't start to embrace a particular candidate and then be able to talk more positively and aspirationally about how we're going to make the lives of voters and Americans better, it's going to be a problem for us, for Democrats, if you are a Democrat in the general election. So in this particular cycle, one of the big buzzwords that I will get to in a second is electability, right? What is electability? I'm going to explain how that's played out in a minute, but we've heard that term since the beginning of this cycle. In some ways, it's kind of nebulous, right? Electability means a lot of things to a lot of people. Ultimately, yes, can you beat the Donald Trump in a general election? But it's still a fairly nebulous term. It really depends on your theory of the campaign and what voters are looking for, and that's been a little hard to pin down. Certainly, it's really important, as Phil said earlier, if you're a Democrat or if you're not a Trump fan, to actually just beat Donald Trump. It's as simple as that. But how do we get there? What's our path? And what's going to both bring in Democrats, particularly the 4.9 million Democrats that voted for Obama in 2012 and did not vote in 2016, and how do we bring those folks back as well? So you heard a lot of theories about electability, and you've seen candidates kind of go all over the place. Well, one thing is definitely true. There is an ebb and flow to any campaign cycle. Candidates go to their base first, they spend some time expanding, and then they go back to the base towards the end. Where is Joe Biden right now? South Carolina. Why? Because he realizes if he doesn't shore up his support, particularly among African Americans now, he's probably never going to have an opportunity to do it. So he's going back to his base, while others are in this process of sort of expanding it, right? Because they're still in that phase. And I think that the 2020 election cycle really, in some ways, began, well, maybe not began in 2008, but there are remnants of the 2008 election here. In particular, if you think about Joe Biden, right? This is how I've been framing this race. Not so much between moderates and progressives, because I definitely think that that's true, but also between an establishment candidate in Joe Biden and disruptors. So everybody else is sort of a disruptor. If you think about Joe Biden now, Hillary Clinton, and think about Hillary Clinton in 2008, she ran as this sort of establishment experience candidate. And it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Because Obama was the hope and change candidate, so she is the experience candidate. She ran as experience in 2008. She had a version of that in 2016. But in both of those elections, voters chose somewhat of a disruptor, Barack Obama, for many reasons, and Donald Trump, ultimately in the general election, for those reasons. So in some ways, Joe Biden, to me, represents the kind of third iteration of that experience establishment candidate. All the while, the American voter has been trending towards choosing a disruptive candidate. So the question for me and for many others is, how much disruption are we really looking for on the Democratic side, and how is that going to work going up against an extraordinary disruptive president? And I'm not assigning a value to that, but an extraordinary disruptive president in Donald Trump. So let's take a look at the candidates and see how they're telling their story. And I'm not doing this in any particular order. I'm going to go back to this point about electability. The concern I had about the electability argument was that one of the arguments for Joe Biden was that he could bring back working class white males. I never bought that, because in many ways, many of those voters across the country haven't been supporting Democrats. They didn't support Barack Obama largely, particularly in the primary. So the question is that a good, sound argument? The concern I had for that is that what's happened now is you've seen voters in some ways turn into their own strategists. Because if you're focused on an electability argument which says working class white males, does that mean that the African American man or the African American woman or the Latino man can't get those voters back? And where are those candidates now? They're gone. And what concerns me about Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Julian Castro sort of leaving that stage is that they take a lot of the issues they cared about with them. When was the last time we heard about the border crisis? Julian Castro talked a lot about that. When was the last time we heard about the caravan? Remember the caravan? Where is that gone, right? So these are the concerns that I have when you craft an electability argument, or that there are pundits and others crafting an electability argument at the onset that ends up excluding other types of candidates because those ideas and issues leave with them. And the truth is, Joe Biden was very instrumental in that, right? Because that argument served his interests best. So let's talk about Joe. Uncle Joe, avuncular Joe Biden, right? It's Obama, Obama, Obama. I was there with him. I was the second in command. I was his chief defender. And if you want somebody with experience, want somebody with the temperament to go after Donald Trump, I'm your guy. It turns out voters are not thinking he's the guy. They may have appreciated his role as Obama's number two, but they don't necessarily see him in the role as President of the United States. We could chalk that up to age, you could chalk that up to a number of different factors, including the fact that he's the third iteration of the experienced candidate, and voters are probably looking for something else. It's also important to note, I think, with Joe Biden, and something we deal with in the context of politics and messaging, just because Obama's messaging was hope and change doesn't mean that that directly translates to you, the person that worked for him. Those coattails aren't that broad, and they don't translate that easily. So that's important to keep in mind. And we saw that, right? Because especially if you're Joe Biden and you keep saying, I'm the next iteration of Obama, but you listen to him perform in the debates, not quite, right? Big difference. And voters, I think, picked up on that. Bernie Sanders, probably the most consistent candidate there is, clearly in this cycle, in terms of message and narrative. Clearly has an enthusiastic base. What's interesting, I think, about Bernie, and it was raised a little bit last night, but I still think it's underreported, is that he, after 2016, kept running, right? So a lot of his supporters and a lot of his ideas have filtered into individual state parties like here in New York and the DNC, those rules about getting candidates on stage because of polling and number of unique donors, that's all his influence because it benefited sort of his type of campaigning. And there's a question as to whether or not the country's ready for democratic socialists. The truth is that a lot of his ideas have already filtered down into city and state government. We're talking about affordable college a lot more than we ever did. We're talking about moving to some kind of universal health care more so than we've ever done in the last, decade or so. And I think that's largely because of him. So is the country ready for, quote, a self-described democratic socialist? Well, we're already sort of in that mix already. Those ideas are already in our head. The question is there enough of, we talked about base and expansion of base. Can he expand his base to be able to go after Donald Trump in the general? One other piece of information about that. If you look back at the primaries in 2016, where he beat Hillary are places that Donald Trump won also. And why does that occur? Because there's a thread of, not their entire messaging, but a thread of their messaging that was similar. System is corrupt, system is rigged, we need to start from scratch, or we need to blow it up and do something radically different. And there are a lot of voters across the country that really do support that. Just very quickly, Pete Buttigieg. So if you like moderation, but think there's something not right about Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg may be your guy. He's young. He does talk about moderate democratic politics and values. I think one of the things that makes him an attractive candidate for so many is that he's pulling in many ways from Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden in terms of the messaging, right? He's appealing both to an educated white voter who's probably a relatively high income earner, but he's also talking about values. He's especially been good at talking about himself as someone from Mike Pence's home state that could be the complete antithesis to everything that Mike Pence and the administration represents. So in many ways, that's really worked for him. Elizabeth Warren is interesting because in many ways, her lane and her messaging was, I am not quite Bernie Sanders. I'm sort of the thoughtful professor, ideas person. I have a plan for that, right? That was her thing. I have a plan for that. You need to get hooked up on a date. I have a plan for that. Somebody actually did do that. And she did have a plan for that. But that was her thing. She presented herself as a person who wanted some substantial change, maybe not radical change, but substantial change with a plan. I think her problem, which is an issue we deal with in messaging all the time, is that she's started to veer too much away from her lane and into Bernie Sanders' lane a little bit. And the truth is, if you like Bernie, why would you go with Elizabeth, where you can actually have Bernie? And so I think she strayed away from her core messaging for a little while and then started to go on the attack, and that hurt her. Amy Klobuchar, I've been wanting to hear more from her since the very beginning. I thought her messaging in terms of Midwestern candidate, as a woman who there were early articles about her temperament, which I thought were very sexist, but it showed her to be this very strong, passionate candidate, and she's portrayed herself as that. She's gotten actually stronger as the debates have gone on, and that's helped her substantially, and I'm glad to see that she came in third place yesterday. She came in third place yesterday. We'll see where we go from here. But what's going to be interesting is Mike Bloomberg, that X factor. Well, it's $3 million X factor, right? It's 300 million X factor. Where does Mike Bloomberg fit into all of this? Well, his decision to avoid the first four primaries was, I thought, if you're just thinking about it from a strategic standpoint, it's smart strategy. I don't need to be on it. He doesn't need to be on a debate stage, because why would he want to debate anybody on stop and frisk right now, right? Why be on a debate stage? Why am I going to be in states that are not representative of the rest of the country when I was a big city mayor of the city of New York? Why don't I just contend on the Super Tuesday, where you have states with big cities, big metropolitan areas that mirror that have issues similar to what we dealt with here in New York? That for him is the do or die sort of day. But the truth is, I think he and Sanders have the money and the motivation to take it as long as they want until they're mathematically eliminated. So now that we have Nevada and South Carolina, where you have more diversity left in these sort of first four states, how do the candidates change up their messaging a little bit? Well, Biden is already in South Carolina talking to black voters because he knows he needs them to stay afloat. Mayor Pete Buttigieg has been notoriously bad with black voters. So what does he just die before South Carolina, or how does he change the conversation about his relationship with that community to try to chip away at some of those votes? It remains to be seen. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are better than he is, but certainly not as good as Biden is with African American voters, though they do have more of an opportunity with Latino voters, particularly in Nevada. So you'll start to hear them talk a little more inclusively. Messages will be a little broader to include probably race-specific language, which you would not hear necessarily going into Iowa and New Hampshire. And as we leave this particular cycle and there are more conversations about the value of an Iowa and New Hampshire in this in presidential politics, I think what you're going to start to see is candidates over the next few cycles broaden their message a bit as they start to appeal to more and more diverse states. But for right now, I would say, in terms just to wrap up, some of the tightest messaging you've seen from a Bernie Sanders and a Pete Buttigieg, and that's why they're having the success they are right now. Everybody else is starting to sort of change and make some very small tweaks to their narrative, but it's having an effect. It actually is becoming obvious to the voter, and that tight messaging, that consistency and repetition, is paying off for the folks that you've seen bubble up to the top. So we're going to take questions later, but you have Dr. Birdsell coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. You want to?
thought I'd be able to say good afternoon, but I'm still 5 minutes shy. We'll pretend it's that time anyway. Hi, everyone. David Birdsell. I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm the one who has never been to Hofstra University before, so it's a great pleasure to be here talking to you all about the campaign. Now, my PhD is in communication, but I have a powerfully difficult time talking about this campaign as fundamentally, at this stage, a communicative phenomenon. All people who study communication are inclined to look at almost everything as an instance of communication, right? That the world is constituted by the way that we describe it. But I think as you listen to both Phil and Basil, and I agree completely with almost everything that they've said, I'm going to take a couple of points of difference here as we move along. We have an environment in which we have had a profound disruption, whether you like him or hate him. Donald Trump has been a profound disruption to politics and political discourse in the United States, and a difficulty reestablishing, if ever indeed we will, what constitutes a center that comprehends a majority of the American public. When we talk about the performance of the primary candidates to date, we've only got 2 elections under the belt, Iowa, New Hampshire, right? Nobody is scoring above 30%, right? We have perilously small margins of victory across a wide range of candidates. In the case of Bernie Sanders, as has been already observed, underperforming his 2016 numbers. And remember there, we were talking about 2 major candidates and then poor Martin O'Malley hanging in the wings, picking up 2 and 3% worth of the vote, right? But now we've gone way down in terms of those cumulative numbers. And that suggests a party that is still very much trying to figure out what it's all about. If you're into disruption, and clearly Bernie Sanders, and I agree completely, has been largely a candidate of disruption, he claims it proudly as a mantle, why would you want to go, if you aren't already a committed Democrat, with an unproven disruptor when you could go with the extraordinarily well-proven disruptive presidency of Donald Trump and just rewind for a second round? I think these are some of the questions that we want to look at. Now, I'm going to do something that is sort of against type for a comm professor, and that is to look at some of the reasons why we have this extraordinarily fractured dialogic environment, narratives that don't overlap or necessarily even conveniently address one another. I don't think it's unique to Donald Trump. I don't think it started there. I think it started at least 40 years ago when Americans began losing faith in their institutions, when we began losing a rhetoric of the positive whole. Some of this was a constructive effort, and I use that term in the broadest possible sense, of political operatives who wanted to tear down the systematic responses built largely through the New Deal and the Great Society and argue that those are illegitimate constraints on freedom, business activity, et cetera, et cetera. Some of it was, in fact, the experience of extraordinary events such as the Vietnam War, such as the Watergate scandal, that from the other side tore down the notion of institutions hiding behind temple fronts in marble buildings, trying to do the people's business in ways that are fundamentally detached from the people. Some of it redounds to social media, and before social media, the advent of 24/7 news. Remember, that's only been with us since 1980 with the birth of CNN, right? And now we suddenly have 24-hour news cycles that we need to fill each and every day on myriad channels, and quite frankly, there isn't that much news. Right? So what they do is take people like Basil and less frequently people like me and put them up to talk about the way that we feel about and analyze facts, right? Phenomena on the ground, while the actual news hole for that hour shrinks to about 4 minutes, right? So when people then claim that the media no longer talk about anything other than opinion and that most of it is opinion on that hourly news wheel, that's true. Okay, that's just simply empirically true. There isn't that much news, and certainly if we look at new news from hour to hour to hour on that wheel, precious, precious little of it. So we wind up dividing ourselves further. I'd like to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the reasons for that division. I'm going to submit to you that one of the fundamental differences that we see in America today is that we are living in different Americas and we have different experiences. I'm going to try to put some numbers behind that and give you a sense of how that might be true and resonant. And that produces political polarization. And it's political polarization that is actually reinforced by the media that we have available to us today. It is I want to talk about then the implications of those things for turnout and issue differentiation among the campaigns. And one of the things that I really hope, at least in this room, at least among us, to put to rest is the notion that there are no differences between Democrats and Republicans. One of the most annoying and absurd claims, I know that Basil had to reckon with this in part of his day job just a couple of years ago, but one of the most annoying and absurd claims, and I want to put up a couple of slides just to suggest why that's actually true. So let's begin with this notion of different Americas and different experiences. And by the way, I need to say, everything that I'm talking about here is a pre-message consideration, right? It is the landscape in which we develop messages and why we develop messages to try to appeal, ultimately, if you want to be president of the United States, to a majority of the American people. Some of these things you know pretty well. We are a nation that is majority white as we speak today, but we will not be majority white around 20 to 25 years from now. There are some variables, fertility rates, our migration policy is the biggest policy change that may affect this, but this is important. If you were, in 1960, voting for John Kennedy, you were voting as, if you were a white person, as a confident member of a supermajority of people who shared your race and ethnicity, at 85% at that point. At about this stage, you drop below the 50% mark, and there is no longer a majority white population in the United States. This is much remarked, and I don't want to spend much time here except to note that much of Donald Trump's support is very concerned about this pathway, about this trajectory, right? And the loss of dominant representation. The way that I like to think about the post-2040 universe, and a lot of people use the phrase majority-minority, which is not my favorite phrase because it is an oxymoron. It is a no-majorities environment in the United States. I live in New York City. New York City has been a no-majority city since 2005, okay? And I think it's arguable that bright political futures live in places where there are no majorities and people have to work with one another in order to achieve policy results. But we're not there yet, and the dying gasps of the white majority are really a political problem for these United States, okay? So, and again, I think this is true regardless of your political philosophy. But I think beyond that, it's important to think about, going back to my major theme here, the different understandings of the United States depending on where you are. Because those racial and ethnic categories mask profound differences along other demographic variables. The median, the most common age among white people today is 58 years old. Okay, that is the largest aggregation of white people, and that very top bar shows you an age bracket with a snapshot in time. But if you're Latino, your most common, the largest number of Latinos in the United States are 11. Okay, 11. Think about that for a moment. And given that we tend to associate with people in our age brackets, we isolate ourselves isomorphically with regard to people who look a lot like us. Old white people are looking at a bunch of old white people. They're saying, what's all this I hear about a darkening America? Everybody I know is white and middle-aged, right? And maybe that's true, but that's not true in the country as a whole. So if you, and you can just look on down the line, African Americans at this point, the largest number of African Americans, 27, okay, just as that snapshot. Asian, 29. Multiracial, 3. Okay, 3. And this is a huge phenomenon that we see with more and more people on census reports describing themselves as in multiracial categories. So big differences about where you sit. Bill Frey at the Brookings Institution put together this chart, and I think it's a really good one to give a sense of the different experiences. And what this chart shows is the year at which, the age in 2018 at which whites become a minority, okay? So if you're under 18 now, okay, in 2020, whites are already a minority. Does everybody understand what I'm saying here? So for all of you undergraduate students out there right now, save those of you who took a gap year, right? Your age mates are already no majority, okay? Right? If you're 18 to 29, that year happens in 2027. If you're 30 to 39, that year happens in 2033. 40 to 49 happens in 2041. 50 to 59, 2050. For me, I'm in that last group, 60 plus. For me, that happens after 2060. And I'm afraid that's the year I turned 103. So that probably doesn't happen for me, right? Among my age bracket, I have a daughter who's 12 years old. She has never lived in a majority white America. And she sees the world differently from the way that I grew up and that my age mates predominantly see it. I really want to drive home this notion of difference. It's very important. We're going to look at some geographic dimensions in a moment. Real quickly on educational attainment, this is, I think, is important too. We have been a nation that has been graduating more and more people from college. And right now we have just a little bit north of a third of Americans who get college degrees. A much larger group graduated from high school and might have some college. And we've been declining in the number of people who don't graduate from high school, but it is still a case, and this is important, a significant majority, about 2/3, a little bit less than that, of the United States has some college or no college, all right? And there are profound economic differences that we see within those groups. This is a little bit dated. The numbers that I'm going to present have gotten worse since this time, but what this chart shows you is what a person was earning in 2013 as a fraction of the 1990 salary in those educational brackets. So what we see over on your far left, if you're a man and you have no high school education working today, you're earning 80 cents on the dollar of what you were earning in 1990. Okay, and these are in real adjusted dollars. So you've lost ground. If you're a woman, you've lost a little bit less ground. And I won't go into detail on this now. The reason for that is that we have seen, even though there are still sharp gaps between men and women in earnings, those gaps have been narrowing somewhat. So you see those changes here. So basically, you're in really bad shape if you have a high school, less than a high school education. If you've got that high school diploma or some college, you're a man, you're down 13%. So you're earning 87 cents in the dollar for what you earned in 1990. Women actually begin to see gains at this stage. The education pays off, and they're at 103% of the 1990 number. Bachelor's degree, okay, now we're beginning to look good. Mom and Dad were right. You should graduate from college, right? That you're getting 7% more if you're a man, 16% if you're a woman, and then advanced degrees, master's degrees, doctoral degrees, law degrees, et cetera, 13% above, 113% of your 1990 numbers, and if you're a woman, 121% of your 1990 numbers. Now, I want you to see this because this is very important to understanding the chaotic perception of what institutions have done. Remember, this is not, when we see charts like this, we have a tendency to think that this is 50% and this is 50%, but that's not so. That's why I showed you the chart beforehand. This is 2/3 of America, okay, by population. This is 1/3 of America. This third, doing pretty well, okay? We're doing pretty well. That other 2/3, doing miserably, and they aren't gaining ground. There are more jobs, but we have seen wage growth at a very, very, very slow pace. And I'm not going to show you charts on that, but you've seen it widely reported in the media. This is a chart, brand new from the Hamilton Project, that maps economic vitality. The areas that you see in blue, that's not Democratic blue, although as you see in a moment, it might as well be Democratic blue. The areas in blue are the places with the most vital economies in the United States. And that looks at cost of living, it looks at the average wage, it looks at a whole bunch of factors to try to see where you're going to do well. The more sort of orangey you are, the worse off you are as a locality. These are not individuals, these are localities. Everybody with me? This is mapped to the county level. Obviously, we can't go onto the interactive map and go to the counties. But, you know, surprise, you look at the Northeast megalopolis, we're doing pretty well. You look at Houston, and you look at San Antonio, and you look at Dallas. You've got pockets of truly great activity here. Along the West Coast areas, up to Seattle, you've got San Francisco, you've got Los Angeles. The urban areas are doing really well. Well, this is a county level map of what the vote looked like in 2016. Notice anything similar about those? That we have this great middle of the United States that is not doing so well. Geographically, it's an enormous majority of the country. In terms of population, not so much. These are very lightly populated areas by and large. Add in the heavy Latino votes right along the Mexican border in Texas and in South Florida, in Southern California, and up through portions of New Mexico and Arizona, and you have an explanation to a certain extent for why it is that much of America, speaking geographically now, voted for Donald Trump. People who are doing poorly economically, and it's not the case that all of Donald Trump's supporters are, out-of-work white males. That's not true, and actually the income profile is a little higher on average than what you see for people who voted for Hillary Clinton in that year, in 2016. But you've got a lot of support and some of the most vocal support from these areas that aren't doing too well. I see this as a profound crisis of every dimension for the United States. Most importantly, constitutional, right alongside that in terms of the ability of the polity to respond to human needs and particularly to economic needs. But it's also a rhetorical crisis, because what works for these urban areas and the way that you formulate your experience and you talk about the people you see around you every day doesn't even sound like reality if you're having that same conversation in the middle of the United States. I have another house right about here, okay? And the politics in that portion of Maine are about as different from the politics of Manhattan as you can possibly imagine, right? And it's not because they're bad people, it's because they see a different America than the one that I see from Greenwich Village. And we need to think about this when we think about the ways that political parties frame arguments. We need to think about this when we understand what it is that unites us as a people that can be described as a people. Right now, unfortunately, we're losing that march. I need to show you this slide because I think it says a lot about people who would, remember, at the end of the day, lead government. That's what the president does, right? At the peak of Gallup, this is a Gallup poll, by the way, and since the Eisenhower administration, Gallup has been asking the question, do you trust the federal government to do the right thing all of the time, most of the time, some of the time, none of the time? At the peak in Lyndon Johnson's first year as an elected official, as an elected president, as opposed to a person succeeding John Kennedy, in 1965, 78% of Americans trusted government to do the right thing all or most of the time. Okay, think about that. 78%, more than 3/4 of us thought that government would do the right thing all or most of the time. Today that number is 18%. It is flipped. Okay? Now, if you don't believe that the government is going to do the right thing, do you want to elect somebody who is going to perpetuate that government, or do you want to elect somebody who's going to blow it up? And if you don't necessarily want to elect somebody you believe actively invested in blowing it up, are you really concerned if it doesn't work the way that it did because, right or wrong, you don't believe it's working now, right? And this creates a rhetorical landscape that I would argue we have yet to figure out how to contain for people who want to work constructively with government programs, not, I would argue, the Trump agenda. Really quickly on this slide, I just want to make the argument that one of the things that we see here is a dramatic difference between people who actually vote and people who would be eligible to vote were they to vote. And we look at this across the board. So in each one of these cases, by age, by race, by education, by income, the left bar are the people who actually vote. The right bar are the people who do not vote. So if we look at it by age, we see that there is a huge, we've got 33% of the people not voting between 18 and 29. If they were to vote, Bernie Sanders would have a very good primary, right? But by and large, they don't. If we look at, if we go over to race, look at the white percentage of voters, almost 3/4, and we look at where whites would be in the non-voters, 52%, okay? And the percentage of the population right now is about 63%. So you've got big, big differences in how this works out, and huge differences when you think about income. This matters a lot, and it is a hard ceiling to where you're going to see your voting numbers come out unless you can actually get the turnout. One of the things that's disrupted in this era are models that political scientists and others use to predict who actually votes and how elections turn out. And some have now moved to a notion that it's actually a matter not, I'm not endorsing this, I'm simply describing it. It's not a matter of leaners and people who can be persuaded in the middle, because people are going to vote majority Democratic if they've done that in the past, and usually for Republicans if they've done that in the past. The question is, who's there? Who are you motivating to go to the polls? And then we get back to Basil's issues with regard to enthusiasm and vision and or fear. You know, why are they there? And who's coming out this cycle who didn't come out last cycle? Political polarization, real quickly. We have been polarizing to beat the band for a long while. Party ID is shrinking for both Democrats and Republicans. There's still a few more Democrats than there are Republicans, but people who call themselves Democrats and Republicans are smaller and smaller as a percentage of the entire electorate. What we see, however, is leaners. So in the light blue here, these are people who are consistently voting Democratic, even though they don't describe themselves as Democratic. In the pinkish, the light red, 13% of the population, the voting population, consistently voting with Republicans, even though they don't describe themselves as Republicans. The actual middle, the people who go either way, is very, very small. Okay, 7% of the voting population at this point. So when we start thinking about what's locked in and what's available, you begin to have another explanation for why the rhetoric doesn't comprehend the whole, but pays attention to tiny fractions of the population, in this case in the presumed middle. I'm going to skip one slide, but I want to point this out. Just in this last year, Republicans have become dramatically more homogenous. We see significant increases in evangelical conservatives as a percentage of the Republican base as a whole. It's up to a third of Republicans are evangelical conservatives, overwhelmingly white conservatives. Moderates, they're fleeing the party in droves. Secular conservatives fleeing the party in droves, and Tea Party and Catholic conservatives beginning to come up, and those used to be reliable, not the Tea Party, but the Catholic conservatives used to be fairly reliable Democratic voters, and that's no longer the case. So you have a more homogenous Republican Party and actually a more diverse Democratic Party. And again, if we're thinking about where you pitch your messages to people who are geographically different, educationally different, regionally different, right, it becomes an extremely challenging proposition indeed. Our partisanship is not just a matter of feeling differently about politics, it's a matter of feeling differently about one another. I'll only take the top line on this graph, and that is among Democrats, 27% are inclined to describe Republicans as a threat to the nation. Okay, not my neighbor down the street who disagrees with me or who is annoying at the party. And, you know, we have arguments over the Jell-O mold every time we have a picnic, but a threat to the nation. That is true of 36% of Republicans in the way that they describe Democrats. Okay, you with me on this? This is another aspect of polarization, and the question is, what do you put back in the bottle? This is such a phenomenon that now, among consistently conservative Republicans, 63%, almost 2/3, feel that it is important for them to live in an area that doesn't have Democrats in it. Okay? Doesn't have Democrats, doesn't have liberals. Now that's true for 1 in 2 liberals who don't wish to be among conservatives either. Okay? So this is, I've got to stress this point here, that we're talking about a level of polarization that is not just a matter of I prefer this kind of politics, but I prefer this kind of politics and I hate the people who disagree with me. Okay? I hate them, I think they're a threat to the nation, and I don't want them anywhere near me. They are not in my discursive universe. And again, for a rhetorician, that presents a pretty serious challenge if I'm trying to assemble a majority. This is a slide that's interesting that I'll just mention and go right over. By international standards, our parties have become extreme, and this is particularly true of the Republicans. That median party is that line that you see about a third of the way from the left, and this is globally, okay, that you have liberal parties and you have more conservative parties, and right over here, you have the Social Democrats in Denmark, you have the Moderate Party in Sweden. Here are the Democrats, a little bit to the left of that, Britain's Labour Party over here, okay? Look at the Republicans. The Republicans are over here. They're almost over to Alternative for Germany territory. And this is another indication. This is not just polarization within the context of U.S. politics, This is polarization with the context of democratic politics all over the world, okay? So fairly significant pieces. Media consumption habits, I don't have time to spend a lot of time on these graphs, but television is the preferred way to receive information for a dwindling minority. There is no majority source of information. Now, you know, I'm ancient, but when I was in high school, there were 3 places that you got your evening news, right? It was on NBC, CBS, and ABC. It lasted for 30 minutes, and about 140 million of the 180 million Americans who were alive at that time watched the same news program. And then you turned it off, and you got to forget about news, except for your Washington Post or New York Times when you read it in the morning, okay, right? Very different today, right? And you have tiny audiences, by contrast, who are self-selecting for largely the political views that they see on that television source. But online is growing, and the next chart I'm going to show you exactly how big that is. So these are the percentage of US adults who get news on the various sites. Almost three quarters, 71% of Americans use Facebook. Okay, wow, yeah, that's a big number. 52% of Americans use Facebook to get news. Now, it may not be their most preferred source, but they're getting their news there. If you were, say, an autocratic leader of a northern and eastern European country who wanted to influence elections, you might look there because that's where the voters are, and that's what they're reading, and of course what they read is what is linked, right? So very, very powerful. Note on YouTube, there are actually more people, that is 3/4 of Americans on YouTube, but Gesundheit. But less than a third actually using it for politics. And then you see the other numbers here. I will just point out, in this notion of polarization and where we go to try to repair these rifts, look at how different the audiences for the various platforms are. This is last summer's information from by the way, for these students out there, if you want to know what's happening with regard to media consumption, please go to the Pew Charitable Trusts and download their information. Terrific material, updated at least annually to tell you where all these things are. But if you look at Instagram for a minute, almost 2/3 of people on Instagram are women, right? And if you look at the numbers, they are overwhelmingly younger women, 18 to 29. This is only adults, by the way. We aren't surveying children in this one. But if you go over to YouTube, 57% of the YouTube users are men. Lots of them doing stupid tricks in their backyards, right? And filming it and sharing it with their friends. And Reddit, 70% are men. So very, you know, if you're asking the question, where as a speaker do I go to comprehend America? It ain't there. There isn't a place to go. You have to go to a bunch of different places to pull pieces of an audience that ultimately may wind up where you want to be. I'm just going to go to 2 more slides, and then I'm going to end, and we'll talk. It used to be the case that Democrats and Republicans were concerned about roughly the same issues. If we look at 1999, immediately before the 2000 election, of course, top priorities for Republicans, education. Well, it was education for Democrats, too. Crime for Republicans. Crime is in the top 5 for Democrats. Social Security, tied for 3. Morality, big on Republicans. Democrats don't care so much about that. Healthcare, number 2 over there. So 4 or 5, there it's the same. Look at top priorities last year looking for the 2020 election. There is no overlap. No overlap. The top priorities for Republicans: terrorism, the economy, Social Security, immigration, the military. For Democrats: healthcare, education, environment, Medicare, and the poor and needy. The president released his executive budget last week. This is the Washington Post's graphic showing what happens in this. And if you were trying to appeal to that Republican set of desiderata, you'd do this, right? You would diminish the money that goes to the Commerce Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, the State Department and USAID, HUD, Interior, Transportation. Essentially, social programs and domestic programs, down, right? Where do you build? You build NASA, you build Veterans Affairs, you build Homeland Security, that's migration, right? And you build Treasury. And those activities comport with this. And I would simply point out, when we look at the Democratic candidates' agendas, there could not be a sharper contrast, and this is the nail that I finally hope to drive through the heart of this notion that there is no difference between Democrats and Republicans. There is a really big difference, and we will tee up that difference in this election cycle when we get to the general, whoever the Democratic nominee is, in a way that we have never seen before. So let me just end with this thought, and I'll knock this out so that we can have our conversation. I believe that the Democratic nominee that we see ultimately will be the person who is successful in crafting a language that can involve a larger base, that can pull people who have been economically disappointed into an environment where they can see hope in concrete plans, and that won't be so scary to a group of people who are doing reasonably well. And remember, Democrats poll enormously well with highly educated and reasonably affluent audiences. So how do you keep those people on board while making sure that you can bring the country together again and make it a more equal place? That's a rhetoric that I'm not analyzing today because we don't have it. But it's going to be interesting to see who is best able to embody it by the time we get to the convention in the middle of this summer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Birdsell. We have a microphone that we can bring around. Oh, you have to come to the mic. Thank you. And if you have questions, please come up and ask.
So I have a question for David. By the way, thank you for sharing thoughts. These were all really provocative and smart, and I really appreciate helping me to clarify my thinking and actually raising questions as well as answering them. My question is specifically for David, and it's about the last thing you said. So we've got people doing well. I'll count myself among them reasonably, and people who are doing really poorly, and I'll count many of my family members among them, some of whom live in Michigan. I have cousins in the poorest county in the state. So this question is really ultimately about the relationship between material conditions and rhetorical constructions. I'm a rhetorician also, right? So how do we craft a rhetoric that does what you say it needs to do, but also really truly addresses the material conditions that we are faced with, which is extreme inequality? I mean, how do you craft a rhetoric that does more than just promise, but that actually delivers what people need, and so makes people like me, so how do you craft a rhetoric of economic redistribution, which is what we need, that gets people to say, okay, I'm on board with that? Because to me, it seems like to really redistribute economically, somebody's got to give stuff up. So I think you could be interpreted, I don't think you are saying this, but I think you could be interpreted as saying, like, so a rhetoric that says to people, don't worry, it's not going to cost you, but we're going to help these people. I'm not sure that's possible, but what would that look like rhetorically anyway if it were possible?
Thank you, Marianne. It's an excellent question. I'm not a political candidate, so I don't think it's necessarily my job to figure out what those political candidates could be saying. But were I a political candidate, I'd be making the following kinds of arguments. If you're doing well right now, that success is under threat. And it is under threat to a certain extent because of the inequality that exists in this country today. As I mentioned, I'm not young. I need to make sure that a diverse America provides a terrific set of jobs for a diverse population. I need to make sure that that diverse population is working and thriving well into my, I won't say graying years because there's less hair to gray, but that as I get older, I need to make sure, it's a self-interest argument, right? That people have good jobs and are able to sustain a tax base. I need to make sure that we're in a country that continues to be economically competitive and that has the international partnerships and the supply chain relationships that it needs to thrive. This is one of the reasons that Xi Jinping is spending $4 trillion on the Belt and Road Initiative. We're not doing anything even remotely close to it, and we're ripping up all the trade agreements that secure the supply chains that we have today. We need to be out there doing that work. We need to understand that if we do not thrive together, we do not thrive individually over the long haul. Next week, next year, for the next 10 years, maybe. But we need to make those investments. And I think that can be an appealing argument. Will it mean that I might have to pay more in taxes? Yeah. Might it mean that I have to support people's education other than the education of my child? Yeah, it might mean that. But I think if we look at that in the positive glow of thinking of ourselves as a people, but right now, I don't know that we have the language to think of ourselves as a people. So that's the first step, is trying to reinvigorate a sense of the polity and our membership in it.
If I can add to that, I think you're right. The problem is, I don't know that we can convince someone of exactly what you said, that I could make someone's life better without making yours worse, right? Like, do I take away from you to help this other person? That's a fundamental problem that I don't know that we get through. I don't know how to get through that in this cycle. Because if you're Barack Obama, for example, and you just talked about hope and change, then yeah, that's enough of a message that's broad enough that encompasses a lot of different types of people. That's true, but it was also very light on policy. I mean, it just was. And that's, from a campaign point of view, that's actually okay, because you just got to get through that process. And then once you get to the White House or win your election, then you can start focusing on the details. But I don't know that there is a skillful enough, we're being taped now, aren't we? I said it already. I don't know that there's a skilled enough candidate today that can truly bring that same message of hope and change and that aspirational quality to the campaign, that someone who is not doing well can say, I can do well under this president, and someone who's already doing well saying, you know what, I think my prospects and the prospects of the country are going to be going in a positive direction. It is an extraordinary skill that takes a skilled politician to deliver, and that's, in retrospect, that's the beauty of a Barack Obama versus, some of what we're seeing now.
The question that I really was asking was, are these actual differences solvable? I mean, is it, can the people who have no health care have health care if I don't have to give up my, that's what is this not really a rhetorical problem? Is it something that there is no rhetoric for because the chasm is we are so economically divided that redistribution has to involve taking away to give to other people? I won't say anything.
No, go ahead. I'll come back to it.
Okay. I'm an optimist, and I happen to believe that, not only is it possible, it has been done. If we look back to the tax rates that we had in this country in the 1960s, we had, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, lover or hater, was vilified for talking about a completely unreal situation where there would be a 70% tax rate on high incomes. We had that. That was what the tax rate was in the Johnson administration. And we could go back to many, many other examples. We used to fund public higher education through state tax levy resources. That's been cut back in 50 of 50 states. We could go back to that and make an enormous difference in the lives of people aspiring to jobs that are only accessible with a college education. We used to have a sense of shame about people benefiting themselves at the expense of shareholders and employees in corporations. I mean, the average multiple of a CEO salary, if we go back 50 years, from the lowest paid worker in that organization was under 10. Now it's over 400. So yes, we absolutely can do this. Now, obviously, we did not have universal health care or any of those things at that point. We had a whole bunch of other problems, and particularly racial exclusion, although we could go on to others as well. But we can do something better. I do think, and with respect to that chart that I showed, and I think it's the most important chart, that loss of trust in institutions, we can't go back to anything. And I don't mean to be understood in saying because we've done it before, we can do it. We must find a better way to do it that is inclusive, that actually reaches every pocket, that aspires for universal health care, et cetera. But do we have the money to do it? Absolutely we have the money to do it. And do we have it in a way that would still allow everybody who is living well to live really well? Yes, we would. I don't think there's any doubt about that if we run the numbers.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. And I think part of the challenge in getting us to that place is that voters vote against their interest all the time.
Yep.
and we have to figure out a way to not have that have that happen. Number one, and number two, I think the arguments that are generated by this fear, particularly by this president, are extraordinarily pervasive. I can't undersell that. And I'll give you an example. An older African American gentleman, the super of the building next to mine, and we talk all the time. There are a lot of conversations that I get into with people who don't know exactly what I do, and I feel that that's helpful because I can get sort of raw information from them. But he has a sense, and he's very upset at the Democrats. He's not a Trump supporter, but he has said to me on many occasions that we as a country shouldn't be so focused on supporting immigrants because what about us? What about us? And first he went to, his first conversation was about, we opened the door for all these Caribbean folk. Now, my mom and I here, she's Jamaican, I'm first generation. So, of course, at that moment, I wanted to walk away, but I didn't want to be impolite. But having said that, I understand, I hear that argument all the time. There is this fear, even for people that shouldn't have that kind of fear. It works, and that's the challenge that I think the Democrats have in this cycle, is to find a way, if not to undo it, to at least tamp it down enough that a voter is willing to take a chance on them and step away from that. Financially, everything you're saying, we can do this as a country, but we have grown accustomed to voting against our own interests, and I don't know if a singular campaign cycle can undo that.
A quick follow-up. This has been such a fascinating discussion, and there's a big debate, right, in political science and communication in the public on polarization and what it means for American politics. One of the questions today, I think, is whether the institutions of American politics need to be changed. This has been coming up in discussions, the Senate, demographics, right, and how our institutions represent those demographics. Do you foresee, for both of you, is that necessary in the coming years to address some of these problems? And particularly with the question of messaging, can there be messaging about institutional change in an election cycle? Or is that something that has to happen outside of an election year? We're talking about the Electoral College, the Senate, and so forth. Thank you.
I'll just do two quick examples of it. Let's talk about the Electoral College. I was an elector in 2016. And I took that job very seriously. And I know a lot of my colleagues did as well. I don't think that's changing anytime soon. There's a pact that some states have signed on to, and there's a trigger for when it goes into effect. I don't think it's going to go, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. But I do think there is momentum for some kind of fix, because something that hadn't happened much in history has happened twice now in my adult life, right? In terms of the popular vote and electoral vote being different. The one thing that I would say about institutions is that as much as we sometimes don't have a lot of faith in them, and as many times as I think this administration tends to talk down to and even attempt to destroy institutions, I do feel it's important, and I say this to voters all the time, that regardless of what you think of Donald Trump, the bureaucracy is still performing. Well or not is another story. It's up to you in some respects, and we can talk about whether it really is or isn't. And I'll give you an example. In the 8 years of Barack Obama, if I remember correctly, there were some 55 federal judges that he appointed. In Trump's three and a half years in office, he's done 50. Since the impeachment conversation started, he has flipped appellate courts to GOP control. So the majority of appellate courts now in GOP control. So, and then think about the judges that are consistently being confirmed by the Senate as we speak. And yet, we're so focused, going back to your TV example, all of the conversation is on impeachment. But there's still work being done by this administration without real attention to it. And so my point is, one of the yes, we can talk about the institutions working better for us on our behalf, but I think if no other time in history, if we could become aware of the importance of elections, it's now, because the people that we put in place run a bureaucracy. Whether if you're a president, or you're governor, or mayor, you run a bureaucracy that is still functioning, and it's the wheels are still turning. So it really does matter who's running it, and the connection between politics and governance, if at no other point in time, should be crystallized because of this president.
I agree with absolutely all of that. Let me just add a couple of things. I think institutions do need to change, but we also need to change what we know about institutions. The rate of civic literacy about what our institutions do, I mean, look at the tremendous work that the Environmental Protection Agency has done each and every day since the 1970s. The most successful piece of environmental legislation, arguably, in the history of the country is the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act has just been significantly weakened, at least as in a proposed executive order, to stop enforcing the Clean Water Act over wetlands that it has covered for 40 years. And the implications could be profound. We have a federal government that's about the same size as it was in John Kennedy's administration, even though the population is twice the size, and the economy is 6 times the size as it was in John Kennedy's administration. So government is not this bloated beast. It's actually very lean by historical standards and doing terrific, terrific work. It's a truism that good news doesn't get covered, right? So there isn't that counter narrative, and at the same time there has been a narrative for a very long time that government is the enemy. Ronald Reagan told us that, right? That government is the problem, not the answer. That the most frightening words in the American language, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you," right? I mean, these were his campaign lines, and that has driven down the morale of public service employees, and it has to a certain extent made it possible for people to deny even the successes of government. So Medicare is the most popular government program, okay, with Social Security right behind it. And you may remember the very telling moment of the campaign trail in 2012 when a woman came up to Barack Obama and said, seething, frothing at the mouth, "Get your government hands off my Medicare." Ma'am, that's a government program, right? And there's a wonderful book, I'll just leave this here, by Amy Lerman. She's a professor at the Goldman School at Berkeley. What she has done is looked at the image of government over the course of the last 60 years. That phrase, good enough for government work, used to be a line of praise at the end of World War II. It meant it had to be perfect because you were going to war with the munitions that were made, good enough for government. Okay? It was turned 15 years later in the Goldwater campaign into a term of opprobrium. The government work was bad. But we need to revivify our sense of what these institutions do as well as what they do in certain circumstances.
Oh, one last question, please.
Okay. We have a potential, very eventful 12 months ahead of us, perhaps like no other in American history. And I say this with some trepidation. So let me present you with 2 scenarios. One, the election campaign runs its course, and it comes out on the eve of the election night with results very similar, close, as they did last time, except the results are reversed. Whoever the Democratic candidate is, he wins. So now Donald Trump, who decides to tell us that there are irregularities and he's not leaving, because he's essentially already told us that. He told us in 2016 that the election was probably rigged, and if he lost, he really didn't lose. Okay, and since then he's told us that when President Xi was elected president for life, gee, that was a good idea. Maybe we should try it. Chuckle, 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 but it really wasn't a joke. Okay, Scenario A, what happens if that happens? Very quickly. Scenario B, Trump stays in office one way or the other. And we know that he's very enamored of loyalty. Loyalty on the part of his subordinates. But let's say that carries over, maybe in a rather maniacal way, to his subjects, the rest of us. And somehow that translates into loyalty oaths for teachers, and that teachers, whether de jure or de facto, maybe it doesn't matter, and that teachers are, are required, or maybe on their own, tell their kids, hey, if you hear your parents expressing any discordant views about the president, just tell us on the side, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, this isn't totally fictional because it's happened in other places and other times. Scenario B. Response.
Wow. So let's see. What do we do if he loses the election and he doesn't want to leave office? Is essentially your first question. I mean, there have been movies made about this. I guess I don't know. I don't know. But look, I guess owing to a point I was making earlier, the government will continue to function, and the bureaucracy will move. And if he doesn't move, he will be moved out of office. Will he be moved out of office and there be some? I guess one of the things that folks have batted around this concern. What you've asked is not something that I've not heard this for the first time today. It's come up quite a few times. The truth is, I think he'll be fine leaving office because then he'll be unplugged, so to speak, and he'll be able to go off and do and say whatever he wants. Now, having said that, don't think he's not going to do that now that he's been acquitted after impeachment, right? Because now you have a president who is essentially unchained. And you saw this in the recent sort of firings, and I expect if throughout the rest of this year, and if he gets another term, he will do more things that will probably be impeachable, right? Because that's who he is. But if he is voted out of office, I think he'll be glad to leave because he'll take his support with him and probably be a thorn in the side of whoever else is there. Number one. Number two, what was it? It was loyalties. Well, if you look at, going back to television, if you look at Sinclair Broadcasting, and there was a point some years ago when all of their networks had to read a statement on air at the exact same time in some kind of allegiance to a particular essentially a sort of a loyalty oath. I do think you'll see that happen much more frequently, and that is scary. And then I think it goes into professors' earlier points about people choosing where they live based on political ideology, and that probably would exacerbate the situation substantially, because why would I want to be sort of living in a place where teachers have to only teaching certain things, or I'm only going to see certain things on television, so on and so forth, right? So I think that exacerbates an already existing problem. But I frankly, if he were to win another term, it is, I think this division and polarization gets substantially worse before it gets better.
Thank you.
Just pick up on that last piece, and I will. I agree that a second term would hollow out the bureaucracy. I'm a little bit less optimistic about the ability of the bureaucracy to respond. People have been leaving government in droves, particularly at the federal level. You see a very different scenario at the state and local levels, and I think that's important. To a certain extent, we're flipping the order of priority in federal versus state and local activity for preservation of some of the kinds of norms and routines that we're talking about, and also have more possibility of change. But if we look at who's departing and who's coming in to do that work, those institutions are more and more strained. And if we had that crisis, I would be concerned. I strongly recommend a book by Levitsky and Ziblatt called How Democracies Die. It's one of the hot academic bestsellers. There are such things. In this last couple of years, but what they do is go through authoritarian governments around the world and show exactly what you're talking about, that transition from, to a kind of post-electoral or a sham electoral strategy. They look at Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin and several, Rodrigo Duterte and several other folks. It could happen here.
And I know we got to be honest with you, and I'm starting to thinking through again based on what you just said, because look what just happened when the president stepped in with this Roger Stone Roger Stone sentencing, and what is it, 6 or so lawyers that were attached to that case have walked away. That is absolutely troubling. So you know what, you might be right.
Thank you all both very much. Seldom do I see everyone stay for when we run long, so I thank you all for staying, and I thank you both for your time, Dr. Birdsell and Dr. Smikle. And have a great day. Thank you very much.